We just heard from the Indonesian president about how electric vehicles could become a pathway for Indonesia to establish an ecosystem and an industry to manufacture vehicles as well as batteries in the future. Electric vehicles as a technology is growing adoption quickly across the world. In fact, in 2022, we are headed towards having the first year in which passenger electric vehicle sales could exceed 10 million units for the first time. Just 5 years back in 2017, passenger EV sales were about 1 million. So 10 times growth in 5 years. And when we look to the future, in NEF's long-term electric vehicle outlook, we expect EV sales to grow to almost 40 million units by 2030 and about 73 million units by 2040. So huge growth opportunities into the future. And with this context, we are privileged to have Mr. Pras Ganesh from Toyota to share the opportunities and challenges that a region like Southeast Asia has as this industry scales up. Pras, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So let's start off with evaluating what are some of the drivers or enablers of electric vehicles in the region. So in your view, what are the enablers for both the adoption as well as manufacturing of electric vehicles in Southeast Asia and Indonesia?
Yeah, thank you for that, Alan. I think in order for us to understand this, first of all, I would like to state that Southeast Asia and Asia in general has excellent prospects for electric vehicle and electrification, both in terms of vehicles as well as parts in the coming years. But the critical element is what are the enablers that allow us to drive scale? Because eventually when we talk about electrification, the most important thing is we need scale to decarbonize, and we also need scale to be able to locally produce. So when we start talking about scaling and doing this speedily, there are three kind of lenses that we talk about within Toyota as the enablers for electrification in any market. The first enabler is really about emissions. Environmental sustainability or emission is kind of a critical element that we need to think about. And here there are two elements we have to talk about. First is the well-to-wheel emission, and the second one is the life cycle emissions. So when we talk about well-to-wheel emissions, it's what is the energy source that we require, or what is the energy source for the vehicle. Still in Asia, unfortunately, the renewable energy actually utilization is not very high. So at the moment, it's still over 90% in terms of non-renewable energy sources in many of the markets, whether it's Indonesia, Thailand, or otherwise. And this is kind of one of the things that we have to speed up and accelerate in terms of renewable energy itself. And even if we talk about levelized cost of energy, right now for renewable energy, it is much higher in most markets other than in India, at least if we look at the Asian market condition itself. So we need to be able to create the factors to drive down the price and create the environment to speed up renewable energy itself. The second is when we talk about the life cycle action, we also need to be able to start looking at how do we look at other elements, for example, not just the vehicle when it's used, but also throughout from the manufacturing process to the end of life. And here I especially want to point out like end-of-life vehicle schemes or 3R activities for batteries. So we need to start getting into these kind of areas as well. So this is on the emission front. That's the first lens. The second lens that we talk about is really the economic lens, and this is absolutely critical. For the economic lens, there are three key stakeholders that we need to focus upon. The first stakeholder is the customer. So the customer has to be able to afford the vehicle. At the end of the day, the customer is selecting the vehicle and buying the vehicle, and it has to meet the customer's needs. And specifically on the economic front for a customer, if we look at a vehicle, and I think I learned this from Bloomberg, BNEF itself, the average price of a vehicle in Asia is around 15,000, 10 to 15,000, for example, in India, and 15 to 20,000 maybe in ASEAN, while maybe in the US it's over 30,000, 35,000. So even if we talk about putting the battery value in Asia would be between 50 to 90% of the price of the vehicle, but maybe in the US or maybe in Europe it could be around 20%. So there's a higher threshold for people to be able to afford it. Until they can afford it, the second stakeholder comes in, which is the government. The government has to then subsidize it. So how long can they subsidize? This is kind of one of the critical elements, and we also need to know that they have to also pay for the infrastructure. And the third key stakeholder is the OEM or the supply chain. As you may know, in Asia, for example, around 12% of the GDP is kind of driven by automotive in Thailand, or around 4% in Indonesia. And there's around, just in Indonesia, for example, over 1.2 million people working in that sector. So we have to allow them for transitioning appropriately. And the third lens, and I'm sorry, it's a bit of a lengthy answer, but the third lens is the customer lens. And this is about how do we get the customer, and this is probably the most important lens, how do we get the customer to understand and what are their factors which determine the choice of a vehicle. Here we have to, of course, understand, I already spoke about price. There's also the infrastructure element that we need to actually allow. And we also need to look at other aspects. For example, charging time, charging use, for example, depending on the usage, how does it make sense for them? Or even other areas like there's some maybe misconceptions or even some issues related to safety. So we need to kind of look at all of these elements. So what I do want to mention is that actually in time, these enablers will steadily mature and the mix of electrification will steadily increase. So I'm very optimistic, but these enablers need to be tackled from all the three lenses.
Sure. So you've given us a lot to unpack, and we have a few minutes here. So emissions, economics, the customer lenses. So when you look at it from understanding the differences between some of the markets which are early adopters in EVs and some of the markets in Asia, what do you think are the unique features, the most important unique features companies should keep in mind when they start off this journey of promoting electric vehicles?
So when we look at Southeast Asia, I already spoke about the vehicle price and I already spoke about energy. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about those. Maybe let me talk about two other factors. The first factor is the diversity. So I think Animesh previously was also mentioning about when we talk about Indonesia, we have Jakarta and then we have the rest of the country. There's a huge difference in terms of the vehicles that are used maybe in a big city. Most Southeast Asian countries have mega cities, higher income, high value, and then a lot of the other market, which we also need to be able to provide them with some form of mobility which they require, whether it's for employment or trade or education or otherwise. So we need to find what is the right solution for all of these people as well. So this diversity is kind of a critical element that needs to be kept. And specifically, even within the context of diversity, we need to understand, like in a market like Indonesia, the smaller cars, A segment, B segment is around 50% of the market. Then there's another element which is commercial vehicles or light commercial vehicles, which is around 20% of the market. So around 70% of the market is already kind of on a different category, whether it's low income or whether it's actually people who are using it for commercial use. So I think we need to understand what the market is, and this is the diversity aspect. The second is actually some of the strengths that Southeast Asia has to support a lot of this electrification as well. So for example, if we take India or Thailand, they have ethanol as well. So this is something that can also be, for example, worked with a strong hybrid motor, and we can almost create a zero-emission vehicle, depending on, of course, whether it's bioethanol, or it's E85 or E100 kind of blend. So this kind of aspect, utilizing the strengths of each country, can create the right electrification pathway for each country. This is what I kind of personally believe.
Sure. Yeah, we'll get into the question about decarbonization and the pathways that different countries could evaluate. I have that question in mind for you. But just sticking on to the point of that you mentioned about being positive about the opportunities for electric vehicles in the region, could you give us Toyota's views in terms of any sort of quantitative outlook for electric vehicle adoption in the region over the next 10 years, for example, within this decade? And what are Toyota's plans for EVs in the region?
So we are bullish in terms of, yes, electric vehicles will grow within Asia itself and within Southeast Asia specifically. So we are already introducing EV vehicles. In fact, I hope some of you may have seen we have the BZ4X, which we launched officially in Indonesia yesterday, and we have the vehicles also running in Bali. We also have other vehicles that we are currently kind of trialing. We're doing some pilot tests, even in Jakarta, for example, or in other markets, to test the market and understand where it makes most sense. So we will steadily introduce EV vehicles within all of our Asian markets, but we also need to develop the capacity. So one specific aspect that we look at is, even if we look at BNEF's assumption in terms of the economic transition scenario by 2030, so around 10% can become a battery electric vehicle. But even that 10%, we should look at where it's easier to adopt the battery electric vehicle. For example, if we use it in luxury is obviously an area that is easier for people to switch, maybe in terms of their second car or they have home charging. So that's kind of an easier area. Another area is, for example, even this kind of island mobility, where the infrastructure can be dedicated. So we can have point-to-point infrastructure, making it easy for people to utilize maybe electric vehicles, as long as we can get renewable energy like on source. And then the third element is, for example, on fleet. We can look at point-to-point fleet transportation. So in these areas, we see some steady growth. But we think that will still be around 10%. So we still have the majority, and rather than leaving that as a traditional ICE, we should electrify that as well. And we see different segments. For example, fuel cell will start making more headway. We think plug-in hybrids and hybrid electric vehicles are also good pathways to decarbonize. And there's also alternative energy, like we were mentioning with biofuels, B40 in Indonesia or E85 in India. These kind of markets can also be integrated, and we can kind of decarbonize as quickly as possible. In terms of specific timings, I'm afraid I am not at liberty to say, but I think you can understand why. But we are very bullish in terms of how we can decarbonize, especially in terms of kind of EVs at certain segments and certain business models, and then electrified vehicles for the rest.
You brought in a couple of points from the initial discussions about the economics not really there for some of these new technologies, and the decarbonization pathways also being reliant on the energy system. So these are some of the big challenges. So let's focus on the decarbonization angle for just a bit more. What are some of the biggest challenges from a company's perspective when you look at it? You also have long-term sustainability targets and decarbonization goals. And probably sometimes you have to make the choice of what's the best drivetrain to drive down emissions over the long term. So when you look at it, what are those big challenges that you grapple with in the region? And what are some of the ways you think governments as well as companies can then overcome these challenges?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the critical element when we talk about decarbonizing transport is to focus on the first word, which is decarbonizing. And when it comes to decarbonization, there is no single pathway to get there. As I mentioned, we have a very diverse kind of ecosystem. There's many people who utilize mobility for various purposes. So how do we actually provide the right mobility source, which is maybe greener and cleaner? This is kind of how we look at this. And specifically, if we look at the electrified, different vehicles, each of the electrified vehicles have some strengths, and each of them also have some challenges. So even if we look at battery electric vehicles, we still see a lot of the energy source, which is still not renewable, or we look at fuel cell, and still the cost of infrastructure is a bit high, or we look at plug-in hybrid, still we have behavior where people don't plug it in appropriately and use it more as a normal hybrid, and we have hybrid which still utilizes some fossil fuel. But all of them do achieve the objective of decarbonization. So the critical element is how do we speed up and scale up greener technologies as quickly as possible. So Toyota has at least the luxury of having all of the technologies. We have fuel cell electric, battery electric, plug-in hybrid electric, and hybrid electric vehicles. And we will launch all of these vehicles and allow, of course, the customer to scale up. And we think if we do that, and this is a very critical point, carbon is cumulative. So what we need to do is we need to reduce the carbon as quickly as possible in every single source. And we also need to understand with the diversity of the markets, for some vehicles, maybe a certain segment or a certain powertrain may work. For some other segments, another powertrain or another technology may work. So we need to be able to provide each of these technologies to the customers and let the customer choose what makes sense. So we call this the multiple pathway approach. And the multiple pathway approach is really this approach where we are trying to say, we have all these technologies, they're all green, rather than focusing on maybe a single technology that can reduce maybe 10%, why don't we also look at the remaining 90% and try to decarbonize everywhere? So this is what we do look at specifically here in terms of decarbonization. And one small point I wanted to add, very specifically, we also need to look at people's behavior. So Toyota is also doing, or Toyota Mobility Foundation has some programs where we are getting people to take public transport, or we are creating first mile, last mile mobility innovations to get people to get onto a train or a metro. So this kind of behavior is also important. We need to start getting people to use more shared mobility or more public transport. These are also things that actually Toyota supports.
Sure. So we have a couple of questions again about this in terms of emissions and decarbonization. Especially, we talked a little bit about, I would say, the tank-to-wheel emissions at the tailpipe level, how to reduce it. And you also mentioned about life cycle emissions. So we have a couple of questions about emissions from battery manufacturing and as well as manufacturing of other technologies that go into greener vehicles. So what are some of the efforts that you think automakers should do or can consider to reduce emissions from a life cycle perspective for some of these new technologies?
Yeah, I think that's a very important and very good question. So maybe, first of all, we need energy throughout the process, whether it's in the, getting the raw materials or actually manufacturing or including in the supply chain, in the distribution of the vehicle, in the usage of the vehicle, and the end of life. So one of the starting points is how do we encourage renewable energy growth as quickly as possible and make it economically competitive for the people. We have some initiatives where we are trying different kinds of renewable energy programs as well. The other thing is we need to start looking, when it looks at life cycle, for example, our R&D is looking at when we are designing the vehicle, how can we make it easier for circular economy-based kind of manufacturing and utilization as well. We're looking at refurbishment to be able to somehow extend the vehicle as much as possible, of course, with lower carbon. So we're doing these kind of solutions as well. And we're doing things like, for example, utilizing kenaf, which is a material available in Indonesia, as a possible alternative to plastic. So this kind of technological advancement is always going on, and including in the battery. Toyota's battery, for example, the lithium-ion batteries, even after 10 years, we believe the degradation is only around 10%, which is because we have managed to sell, and this is something that's not understood, we've sold over 20 million electrified vehicles, a lot of them hybrid, but which allows us to be able to actually also improve our battery technologies. So this is one of the areas in terms of the development process. And we're also working on the manufacturing. So we have a net carbon zero target for all manufacturing by 2035. So we are now already doing a lot of things. For example, in our factories, it's kind of interesting, and at some point in time, I hope you guys get a chance to visit it. In our plants, we try to reduce electricity by using gravity. We call it karakuri, where we utilize, for example, the gravity to move the parts. This kind of way to eliminate energy utilization as well. So we need to use all of our innovation throughout the life cycle to be able to reduce the actual usage. And by looking at life cycle action and focusing on decarbonization, I think we have a better opportunity to reduce carbon today in terms of solutions as well.
Sure. On manufacturing itself, so we heard President Jokowi talk about placing Indonesia in the center of the electric vehicle manufacturing ecosystem globally. So when Indonesia or other Southeast Asian countries are looking at this opportunity into the future, what do you think are some of the factors that they should consider to create a globally competitive EV ecosystem, manufacturing ecosystem in the country?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think when we're thinking about the competitiveness, maybe there's two elements that we need to think about. One is cost, and the second is the quality. These are the two elements that probably need to go into developing this ecosystem. When it comes to cost, at the moment, still a lot of the market is very fragmented, and as I explained, a very diverse market. So there is a necessity for more freer trade, which allows maybe all of the markets to kind of group the demand, and potentially utilizing the strengths of each market, we can have different electrified parts. Just typically as an example, all of our electrified vehicles, whether it's battery electric or fuel cell electric, plug-in hybrid electric, or a hybrid electric vehicle, have the same components. They have the battery, they have the transaxle with motor, they have a PCU. So there's the possibility that we can kind of utilize the strengths of each of the markets, whether it's in electronics, in manufacturing, in raw material, and create an ecosystem across. But they require some cooperation and allowance of free trade. In terms of the quality, we really have to work on the human resources development. So this is an area that we've been working on, including with some state-owned enterprises, for example, in Indonesia, to level up the capability of battery manufacturing, or in terms of the electric or electrified part manufacturing, using IoT and DX as well. So I think it's really about cost and quality, but these are areas that we can definitely work on.
Cost and quality. Let's end our conversation there. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that.